"This is not the woman I agreed to marry," said Rafferty Drummond, Duke of Lynvale. He spoke softly, as a man might who expected everything to be in its proper place, and found without disaster that one thing was not. The woman in his library held a book, her thumb marking her page, and met his gaze with the steady air of someone caught in an entirely reasonable act, fully intending to carry on. "Neither," said Henrietta Cavendish. "Is this the man I expected?" She smiled then, not the careful, practiced social smile she had used since their arrangement had been settled in October. This was a true smile, beginning at one corner of her mouth, as if remembering it had permission to spread, and then completing itself. Custard, the cream Persian cat who occupied the armchair by the fireplace as a matter of inherent right rather than invitation, opened one eye, observed the exchange, and promptly closed it. Outside, the November rain addressed the Lindvale Park oak trees with the patient insistence of Yorkshire weather. A unique silence settled, the kind that follows when two people have just spoken an unvarnished truth. Then Rafferty said, "I suppose we ought to talk about that." "Yes," Henrietta said, "but first, do you have the second volume of this? Because I'm at the part where Emily reaches the castle and I need to know what happens. I should explain how they arrived at this moment. I should tell you specifically about the hidden novels and the flounder and the kitchen at 6 in the morning and the letter from Lord Bowmont that used the word uncomplicated and the precise effect that word had upon its arrival. Because this, I assure you, was not what either of them had anticipated. Henrietta Cavendish arrived at Lindvale Park in November with 2 trunks, a cherished travelling bonnet, and a thoroughly inaccurate impression of the man she was to marry. Rafferty Drummond, Duke of Lynvale, had spent 3 weeks preparing to meet a sensible, quiet, uncomplicated woman. What he prepared for was not what he received, and what she prepared for was not what she received either, which I believe is often the starting point for the best stories. Their marriage had been arranged by solicitors, a common enough practice. Less common was the degree to which both parties had approached the arrangement with a practical honesty neither privately expected the other to possess. Rafferty had agreed because his mother had been correct about the household's need for a mistress for 4 years, a truth he had avoided, and because the terms were favourable. Furthermore, the solicitor's report on Miss Cavendish described someone capable of managing an estate, a quality he valued above most others. Henrietta had agreed because her father's health was failing, and the connection would prove useful. Also, the alternative was Sir Gerald Pratt of Bath, whose choice of waistcoat patterns suggested troubling judgment. The report on Rafferty Drummond, conversely, described a man who valued efficiency and competent estate management, which to Henrietta sounded like someone she could understand, even if she couldn't quite predict him. Neither had met the other before the 14th of November. They had exchanged a single letter each, via their solicitors, both civil and as informative as a legal document without quite being one. She arrived in a carriage that carried the lingering scent of her brother Horace's pipe. Horace, 19, was cheerfully unqualified for most things, including the decision that he should accompany his sister to Yorkshire. Henrietta had dissuaded him by suggesting there was a magnificent uncategorized library at Oxford, and he was the obvious candidate to begin its organization. She arrived, therefore, alone, which suited her. She wished for the 3 days of travel to simply think. She thought about the solicitor's report, which she had read 4 times. Rafferty Drummond, 32, Duke of Lindvale, Yorkshire estate, 1 London townhouse, income described in favourable and specific terms, a previous engagement broken off 7 years prior by mutual agreement with no scandal attached. Physical description: tall, dark-haired, well-built, no remarkable features. Character: known to speak rarely, but accurately. She had described him to Horace on the morning of her departure as promising but unconfirmed. The approach to Lindvale Park led through a valley that the November light had chosen to illuminate with serious intent that afternoon, arriving low and golden through the bare oak branches along the lane. She kept the carriage window down for the last half-mile, despite the cold, eager to see the place before she was inside it. The house came into view past a bend in the lane. Stone, substantial. 3 stories of Yorkshire practicality, imbued with the particular dignity of age, its long windows catching the last of the light. A plume of smoke rose from the western chimney. A groom crossed the yard in the distance, leading a horse. She absorbed it carefully as she did anything she was about to live with. It looked like a place where quiet things happened, she thought, which was either precisely right or entirely wrong, and she would know by morning. What the solicitor's report did not mention were the novels. The library at Lindvale Park was substantial. 3 rooms deep, 2 floors tall in the central section. It carried the scent of old leather and wood smoke and something herbal she could not identify, eventually tracing it to a small lavender sachet tucked behind the atlases. She suspected it had been placed there by someone who truly loved that room. She had come down at 11:30 on the night of her arrival, unable to sleep. New houses made her wakeful. She needed to learn their sounds before she could rest in them. The particular creak of this floorboard, the way this wind found that window, the horse in the second stable that voiced its brief periodic conviction against the dark. She took a candle from the hall table and went in search of a book. She examined the first 2 shelves thoroughly. Landscape, geography, classical history, political economy. She rather enjoyed political economy, a piece of information she generally kept to herself in company. She moved to the 3rd shelf and paused. The Michaelmas quarter accounts were upside down. She was a woman who noticed things. The upside-down accounts were in precisely the wrong position for a man described to her as exacting. She pulled them out. Behind them, Anne Radcliffe's complete works, a well-worn Clara Reeve, 3 Matthew Lewis novels, and rather wonderfully, a copy of Sense and Sensibility with pencil notes in the margins. She chose The Mysteries of Udolpho, Volume 1, and settled into the armchair nearest the fire which still held the warmth of the evening. Custard arrived approximately 8 minutes later, assessed her, and settled on the arm of the chair with the deliberate air of one who had decided to permit a situation. The library at that hour, at that temperature with that particular fire, felt like a room that granted a special privilege. The lamp she carried cast a circle of warm light over her chair and the books within reach, leaving the rest of the shelves in the amber half-dark that libraries preferred. She could hear the rain on the windows. She heard the horse in the second stable, twice, brief and objecting. She was perfectly content. She was at chapter 7 when the library door opened. Rafferty Drummond entered and stopped. He was dressed as someone roused from sleep, having come downstairs to investigate a light, his coat pulled on in haste, one collar button left undone, a detail she observed but did not mention. He was taller than the report had suggested. His eyes were moss green, and he possessed the build of a man who had spent a decade in the army and not entirely forgotten it. His expression upon seeing her in the chair with his hidden Gothic novel was not one of alarm, but a very serious recalibration. He looked at the book. He looked at the stack of Michaelmas quarter accounts on the floor beside her, which she had placed spine up because she respected spines. He looked at her. "Good evening," she said. "Good evening," he replied. "Miss Cavendish." "Your Grace." She held up the Radcliffe, partly in confession and partly in display. "You have hidden 3 Radcliffe novels behind the Michaelmas quarter accounts. I thought that said something rather telling about you." A pause. The fire shifted in the grate. "They were placed there," he said, with the careful delivery of a man weighing several options and choosing the most defensible for storage. "Of course," she said, with perfect courtesy. He came further into the room. Custard, who had been observing this development from the armchair, adjusted to a more formal posture, as a cat does when something important occurs and it wishes to be seen taking proper note. Rafferty came to stand near the fireplace and looked at the cat, and the cat looked back. "Custard," he said, as introduction or greeting. It was not entirely clear which. "Your cat?" she asked. "The household's cat." He considered this briefly. "He came with the house. I'm not certain he recognizes the distinction." She looked at Custard, who had by then decided that if she were to remain in the armchair, she might as well be acknowledged, and had arranged himself across its arm with the air of one who had made a formal decision. "He sat on my travelling bonnet when I arrived," she said. "The brown one with the ribbon. I think he was making a point. He usually is." Something in Rafferty's voice occupied the space where a smile might have been. This was the first thing she noticed that did not match the solicitor's report. She asked him about the second volume of the Radcliffe, which was in the Atlas section where she hadn't thought to look. He found it without much searching, which suggested a second hiding location she had yet to discover. He handed it to her. "The pencil notes in Sense and Sensibility," she said before he reached the door. "Were those yours?" He paused, his hand on the latch. The fire gave one of its occasional small sounds. Outside, the Yorkshire rain continued its methodical descent. "Good night, Miss Cavendish," he said. She smiled at his retreating back and opened Volume 2. The dinner took place on the evening before the wedding in the dining room, which carried the scent of beeswax, the last of the autumn roses in their vase, and the particular warmth of a room heated for several hours in anticipation of use. It was a small party. Rafferty, his mother the Dowager Duchess, Mr. Leith, the secretary who had served at Lindvale long enough that his presence at family occasions had acquired a kind of honorary permanence, and Henrietta. She had dressed thoughtfully in a silk of deep amber, a colour well suited to the room's light and, as she had learned from Mrs. Fenwick's expression when she descended the stairs, exactly right. Mrs. Fenwick, a woman of 60, had managed Lindvale Park for 23 years and conveyed her opinions primarily through the quality of her silences. The silence that greeted the amber silk was one of approval. The Dowager Duchess, 64, possessed Rafferty's moss-green eyes and what Henrietta would later identify as his same quality of watchfulness, though in the Dowager it came with visible amusement. She took Henrietta's hand upon their introduction and pressed it once with the directness of someone who had decided she would like this person and saw no reason to delay expressing it. "Miss Cavendish," she said, "I've been told you're practical." "I hope so, Lady Drummond." "Good. Practical women are undervalued and very useful. I hear you've already been to the library." Henrietta kept her expression perfectly neutral. "It's a very fine library." The Dowager's eyes flickered to her son's face and returned to Henrietta's with the satisfaction of a woman who had just confirmed a long-held theory. "Isn't it?" she said. Dinner was elaborate, excellently prepared, and consumed with the careful conversation of people presenting their most acceptable versions of themselves. Rafferty managed the table with precise attention to practical requirements, ensuring glasses were filled, dishes explained, and conversation flowed smoothly between topics of general interest. He was adept at this, as a man becomes adept at something he has done correctly for a long time without particular enjoyment. She watched him perform and performed her own version simultaneously, a skill she had honed over several seasons of dinners with people who expected a certain kind of Miss Cavendish. The Miss Cavendish at the dinner table was accomplished, interested, measured. She knew when to speak and when to wait. She could maintain a conversation on 3 subjects at once without seeming to try. She had been doing it since she was 17. The distance between this Miss Cavendish and the one who had sat in a library at midnight reading Gothic fiction was not vast, but it existed. Like a slightly ill-fitting glove, nothing to cause a scene, but something she was acutely aware of. Across the table she suspected the Duke of Lindvale wore a similar glove. They managed 2 conversations about landscape, one about Bath, one about a mutual legal connection in Somerset, and one about a parliamentary matter that Mr. Leith introduced and that Rafferty answered with the efficiency of someone who had that particular topic neatly organised in his head. Then, between the fish and the game, she made an observation about the drainage pattern she'd seen from the carriage on the approach to Lindvale, specifically about the way the eastern fields sat wet, and his attention shifted. Not the polite attention of a man indulging a remark. This was genuine attention. He asked a follow-up question, then another, and for approximately 4 minutes they had a conversation about Yorkshire clay soil, field elevation, and the specific challenges of north-facing drainage in autumn. That was in every particular a good conversation, the kind that happens when 2 people are truly talking rather than performing conversation. And then Mr. Leith said something about the coming week's weather, and the moment dissolved back into dinner, and both returned to their gloves. The Dowager Duchess ate her syllabub, said nothing, and wore the expression of a woman who had seen something and would be contemplating it for some time. The church at the edge of the Lindvale estate was small and old, carrying the scent of cold stone, candle wax, and the ghost of summer flowers. The frost had settled across the churchyard grass that morning with the precision of something that had practiced all autumn and was now performing its best work. Light streamed through the narrow windows at the low angle of a November morning, lending everything the quality of a painting left in a cool room. Henrietta wore her mother's pearl earrings. She had taken them from the small box that travelled with her on every journey and put them on that morning with the careful attention she gave to things she did not wish to treat carelessly. She had stood before the mirror in the Lindvale room for a moment, long enough to think, here we go then. She had a new dress. Pale gold, Mrs. Fenwick's suggestion, and a correct one. She wore her own sensible boots and her mother's earrings, which were not strictly necessary, and yet entirely so. Horace had not made it. She had known he wouldn't. The regret she felt was real, and she carried it quietly through the ceremony, then set it aside in the place she kept things that needed carrying but not examining. Rafferty was already at the altar when she arrived. He had made an effort with his appearance which she noticed, and he likely didn't intend to be noticed. His coat was not the one with the undone button. His posture was the carefully managed posture of someone being very precise about remaining calm. She recognized this, for it was precisely what she was doing. He turned when she reached him and looked at her, and for a moment, a very brief, unmanaged moment, something crossed his expression that was not the formal attention of a man performing a ceremony, before he recollected himself. The vows were said. Hers were clear and precisely delivered, each word placed with the careful exactness of someone who had rehearsed them and was nervous in a way that manifested as over-correctness rather than trembling. His vows came in a voice lower than expected, and at one word, small, barely consequential, he lost the thread for half a beat. He found it again immediately, continued. No one in the church would have noticed unless they had been paying very close attention. She had been paying very close attention. Afterward, the luncheon at the house. The Dowager, Mr. Leith, Mrs. Fenwick, two senior tenants whose connections to the Drummond family stretched back to the previous century and whose presence was considered essential by all parties, including, probably, themselves. An excellent venison pie. An exceptional plum cake, for which Mrs. Fenwick received quiet compliments with professional modesty. Custard attended the luncheon without invitation. He arrived through a door someone had left slightly ajar, assessed the room, decided the tenant on the left presented an acceptable risk profile, then crossed the room and settled with finality in Henrietta's lap, where he remained for the rest of the afternoon, purring with the satisfaction of an animal who had made a considered decision. This was observed by everyone present. Mrs. Fenwick mentioned it later, with a quality of meaning to the parlour maid. The Dowager mentioned it to no one, but filed it with great care. Henrietta sat with custard in her lap, one hand resting on his warm back, and thought in her quiet way, "This is the beginning of something I haven't imagined yet." She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that this was not a frightening thought. November became December without much ceremony, which was the Yorkshire approach to most things. Henrietta learned Lindvale Park as she learned everything, by attention and by walking through things at 6 in the morning before the world had organised itself enough to prevent her. The east corridor needed a door latch. The kitchen garden was larger than practical and slightly disordered in the section nearest the south wall. The estate accounts were in excellent order in most respects, and in slightly less excellent order in the category of small household expenditures, which had drifted in the absence of a duchess for 4 years. She began keeping notes in the small notebook she carried everywhere, a habit she was aware might appear alarming if anyone examined it too closely. She also, more carefully, began to learn Rafferty Drummond. He was precise. He was also, she discovered, the kind of precise that stemmed from caring about things more than was fashionable to admit. This was a distinction the solicitor's report had failed to capture, which was perhaps understandable. It was not the sort of thing one could put in 17 pages without committing to an opinion. She discovered his estate notebooks on a Tuesday, not by invitation. He had left one open on his desk in the estate office when she came to discuss the kitchen garden, and he had not yet returned from the stables. She had been about to look at the window and think about something else entirely when her eye caught the margin of the page he had left open. Small drawings. A horse, profile left, drawn with enough care to be recognizable as a specific horse. The chestnut in the second stable, she suspected, the one with the contrary opinion about bridges. A tree near the north fence, drawn in 3 lines with the accuracy of someone who had looked at it a great many times. a drainage grate with what appeared to be water flow indicated. And then, 3/4 of the way down a page that was otherwise a complete and efficient record of a November tenant meeting, one very small and wholly unexpected fish. She stood in the estate office and looked at that fish longer than was strictly explicable, then went to the window and looked at the kitchen garden and thought about what to do with this piece of information. What she did with it was nothing. She stored it carefully, as one stores a thing that requires more context to interpret, and waited. She also discovered that he talked to Custard. She heard it first through the estate office door on a Thursday afternoon, as she passed with the kitchen garden notes, and did not knock. A low voice, not quite a murmur, discussing the North tenancy rotation with the level-headed delivery of a man who talked to cats because the cats were reliably present and entirely discreet. Then a pause. Then, "You have no opinion on this, I know. You don't have to look at me like that." Custard was presumably looking at him like that. She walked away without knocking and stood in the east corridor, the one with the new latch, and felt with some intensity that she had been entirely wrong about this man and wasn't yet sure what to replace her previous picture with. The solicitor's report had given her 17 pages and the wrong impression. The cat dialogue had given her more in 20 seconds than all 17 pages combined. She added this to the map she was building. Precision that came from caring. A man who managed things because he wanted them managed well, not because managing them allowed him to remain at the surface of his own life. There was a difference, and it was beginning to matter. She also discovered that same week a small detail she turned over in her mind for several days before understanding what to make of it. In the estate office, behind the Michaelmas quarter accounts, which were now right side up, she had fixed this, though she had said nothing about it, was a second shelf she hadn't seen before, partly obscured by the corner of a cabinet. On this shelf, 3 sketchbooks, old ones, the leather soft with age. She didn't open them. They weren't hers to open. But she noticed their worn quality, the frequency with which they had apparently been used, and she added them to her map. A man who had once drawn things extensively, who still drew fish in the margins of tenant records and horses in the corners of notebooks, who had at some earlier point apparently drawn enough to fill 3 books, and who had then placed those books behind a cabinet in the estate office where they were visible only if one were looking. She was looking. He was learning her also. She was aware of it in small ways, the slight shift in his attention when she said something he hadn't expected, the notes he made when she mentioned something about the estate, the fact that he began gradually to ask follow-up questions in their conversations, rather than simply receiving her information and responding to it efficiently. On a Thursday morning in the kitchen garden, in cold that made her breath visible, and the last of the dead rose canes rattle at the south wall, she explained her idea for the redesign. Better sun access for the herb section. The current layout wasted the warmth of the south wall entirely. The beds were positioned for what they had been, rather than what they could be. He listened. The south wall was my mother's original plan. A pause in the cold air. A blackbird in the garden offered a brief, indignant comment on the weather. "The wall itself is fine," she said carefully. "I was thinking of the beds in front of it." He considered this for a moment, looking at the wall. Then he said, "Show me." They spent an hour in the garden. It was not comfortable. The cold had the conviction of a December day, and her breath made small clouds in the air between them, and the dead rose canes at the south wall rattled with every pass of wind. At one point, a robin arrived on the fence post nearest them, and sat there with the specific attitude of a bird that held opinions about what people were doing in its territory at this hour. Neither of them commented on the robin. It was, she thought, exactly the right conversation to have standing in the cold, rather than sitting comfortably at a desk, because it was a conversation about what to keep and what to change, the kind of conversation that benefits from being in the thing itself. You understand a place differently when you're cold in it. She was building a map of him piece by piece from the available evidence. A man of genuine precision who had been trained to keep that precision at the professional surface. A man who talked to cats and drew fish in notebooks and had read Sense and Sensibility closely enough that his pencil had opinions. A man who, she was beginning to suspect, had been being a duke for so long and so correctly that he had gotten somewhat out of practice with the parts of himself that weren't useful for that. She thought he might be getting back into practice. She also thought in the privacy of her own mind that she was glad to be there to see it. Mrs. Perkins had been waiting 3 months for an answer about her roof. Henrietta learned this from Mrs. Fenwick, who mentioned it between items in the household accounts, with the air of someone who had been not saying something for some time and had finally decided that the new duchess might be the appropriate audience. 3 months. A farm family on the north edge of the estate since the third Duke's time, 2 written requests to the estate office, a third verbal one, an east roof failing through 2 seasons of Yorkshire rain, a lease clause, clear as print, placing structural repairs at the estate's responsibility. 3 months of nothing, because the previous steward had classified the repair as a discretionary improvement rather than a structural necessity, and a discretionary improvement was lower priority than the 17 other things on Rafferty's desk. And the 17 other things on Rafferty's desk were on the desk because he was one man managing a large estate without a steward who was classifying things correctly. 3 months, Henrietta said. Mrs. Fenwick said nothing. Her silence held the quality of a woman who had said exactly what she intended to say and was prepared to wait. Henrietta put the household accounts aside and went to find her walking boots. The North Farm was 40 minutes on foot through the cold, a distance she did not find unreasonable. The path followed the eastern fence line, then crossed a field that had been cut and was now frozen stubble and crow territory, 3 crows in particular taking a keen interest in her passage. It then went over a slight rise from which she could see, in the middle distance, the farmhouse and the particular irregularity of the east ridge that told the story without any other evidence required. She had seen enough failing roofs in Somerset to read them at a distance. This one was not yet a catastrophe. It would be by March if nothing was done, and March was approximately the opinion the freeze was conducting right now about everyone's plans. The frost had retreated from the fields that morning, but the mud had opinions about where it belonged, and her boots were adequately acquainted with mud. She arrived with sufficient colour in her face to satisfy any Yorkshire observer that she had earned the visit. Mrs. Perkins, 53, was built for the long view, in the manner of women who have spent 30 years managing land with half the resources they deserved and have accordingly developed economies of energy and expression. She received Henrietta in the farmhouse kitchen with tea that appeared in 5 minutes and a directness Henrietta found immediately agreeable. The kitchen smelled of bread and wood smoke and something on the range that had been simmering long enough to have become better than whatever it started as. The table was scrubbed pale. Through the window, the east end of the farmhouse was visible, where 2 courses of the roof ridge showed the displacement that happened when water had been getting in for long enough to find its preferences. Mrs. Perkins produced the lease from a tin box, organised with the precision of someone who had learned that documentation was the only reliable friend in a dispute with an estate. The relevant clause was clear. The relevant clause had been clear for 140 years, and the roof had presumably been cooperating with this arrangement until recently. Henrietta asked 3 questions, each one a question Mrs. Perkins had been waiting to be asked. She wrote the answers in her notebook with the small, efficient handwriting she used when working. She drank her tea, which was strong and excellent. She told Mrs. Perkins that she would have an answer by the end of the week, which was perhaps optimistic, and then she walked back to Lindvale Park in the mud and the thin winter light and spent Tuesday evening finding Mr. Leith. Mr. Leith was 47, precise, small of script, and possessed the quality of a man who had been doing his job correctly for 12 years and was willing to be told when one piece of it had gone wrong without requiring the piece to be described as a disaster. She found the previous steward's categorization, showed him where it diverged from the lease, and drafted the authorization for the repair while he watched with the expression of someone recalibrating his understanding of the new Duchess of Lynvale. She presented it to Rafferty the next morning. He was reading at his desk, which he preferred to do standing up, and he read the authorization and the attached note in the way he read things he was paying full attention to, entirely still, with the slight forward incline of concentration that she had begun to recognize. "How did you know about Mrs. Perkins?" he asked. "Mrs. Fenwick mentioned it." He was quiet a moment. "Mrs. Fenwick said nothing to me about this." "No. She mentioned it to you." Yes. He put the papers down and came to the window where she was standing, not because it was the most efficient position in the room, but because it was where she was. He stood beside her with the careful distance of a man being correct about space. Outside, the December estate lay frozen and grey and entirely manageable looking, which was something Henrietta had noticed about difficult things viewed from above. "You walk to the North Farm," he said. "It's a reasonable distance. In December. I find walking useful for thinking." A pause. He was looking at the estate. "You also," he said, "found the east corridor latch. It needed a new fitting. I asked Jennings to replace it. I hope that was—" "Yes," he said before she finished. "That was correct." She looked at him. He was looking at the estate, not at her, but there was something in his expression that was not the professional attention of a duke reviewing a practical matter. It was the look of someone who has expected a thing to be one way and discovered it is another, and is in the process of deciding whether the discovery is unsettling or not. "I don't know what to make of you," he said. He said it simply, without apology, as a statement of a genuine fact about his current experience. "That seems fair," she said. "I'm still working it out as well." He looked at her then for a moment that was not quite brief. Then he reached across the desk and signed the authorization. Mrs. Perkins had a crew on the roof by Friday. The letter arrived on a Friday in January, with the post from London in a bundle that Mrs. Fenwick sorted by the hall table in the usual arrangement. Estate correspondence to the left, personal correspondence to the right. The letter from Lord Bowmont had been placed by innocent mischance on the right. Henrietta came downstairs at 7:15, before Rafferty, which was her habit. She had sorted through the right-hand correspondence before. It was something she had begun doing out of organizational instinct, and continued because it was useful, and because no one had suggested it was otherwise. She worked through the first 3 letters, with the practiced speed of someone accustomed to correspondence. She opened the 4th because it was unsealed, not recognizing at first whose hand it was, and read the first 3 lines before she understood. Then she read the rest. Lord Bowmont's handwriting was confident and somewhat sprawling, the handwriting of a man who trusted his meaning to carry itself without excessive assistance from his pen. The letter was warm in tone, the warmth of a long friendship that had survived time and distance and presumably a few catastrophic decisions, of the kind that long friendships accumulate. It congratulated Rafferty on having finally, as it put it, taken the step. It said it was long overdue. It said several things about Yorkshire, and whether one had to spend so much time there that were affectionate and gently mocking. And then, with the specific well-meaning bluntness of a man who considered himself a good friend, and this to be the friendly thing to say, "I hear your duchess is exactly the thing. Capable, composed, uncomplicated. Suits you down to the ground, I'd say. Do bring her to London when the season cooperates. Send my regards to the orderly household." She set the letter down on the hall table. The word uncomplicated sat in her chest with a weight disproportionate to its size. She was aware that this was perhaps a letter reflecting impressions Rafferty had formed before he met her, formed on the basis of a solicitor's report and his own expectations, and that it was therefore not precisely an accurate statement of his current view, and that she was reading too much into the vocabulary of a man she had never met. She was also aware that none of these considerations made the word uncomplicated feel lighter. Rafferty came downstairs at 8:20. He stopped when he saw her face. He read the letter. It took him less time than it had taken her, because he read faster, and he already knew what it said without quite having seen it yet. He set it down. "I can explain," he began. "I know you can," she said. "I'd like you to." He was quiet for a moment. Custard had arrived on the hall table, which was against the rules Custard treated as suggestions, and sat at the edge of the letters pile with the alertness of an animal that could tell something significant was in progress. "I wrote to Bowmont in October," Rafferty said, "before I'd met you. He asked what I was looking for. He chose his next words with the precision she had come to recognize as real precision rather than performed precision. I said, practical, capable. Someone settled. He has translated this as uncomplicated. Yes." She turned to look at him fully. His face had the quality it had when he was being careful about a difficult thing, not closed but attentive, watching what he said before he said it. "Is that what you were looking for?" she said, "before I arrived?" "Yes." "And what I am," she said, "is not that." A pause that was longer than the others. "You have corrected my secretary's filing system," he said, in the measured tone of a man counting his evidence. "You have replaced a door latch. You have walked 3 miles in December mud to interview a tenant about a lease clause and produced a corrected work order within 48 hours. You have reorganized the south kitchen garden on principles I am still working through, and you have read 4 of my novels." He stopped. He looked at her directly. "You are not uncomplicated. I had not," he said, "accounted for that. Is it a problem?" He looked at her. Custard had relocated himself to the direct center of the hall table and was sitting between them with the posture of a mediator who had not been asked to attend but had opinions about the outcome. Rafferty moved the cat with the practiced ease of 4 years of cat removal and set him on the floor, where Custard registered his displeasure by sitting exactly where he was put and looking at the ceiling. "I don't know," Rafferty said. He said it without evasion, which was what she had learned to watch for when he stopped performing certainty. "I thought I did. I no longer think I did. It was not a reassurance. It was something better than a reassurance." "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right. You don't know. I don't know either." She picked up the tea that Mrs. Fenwick had left on the side table. "We've been married 3 weeks." 21 days, he said. Then he appeared to hear himself and was briefly silent. She looked at him over the rim of the cup. "You've been counting. It is simply—" he began, and then a quality came over his expression that she hadn't seen before, something caught and acknowledged and not retreated from. "Yes," he said, "I have been counting." There was a silence that was entirely different from any silence they had had before. Custard jumped back onto the hall table, because Custard's opinions about floors were temporary, and settled himself at the edge of the pile with the air of someone who had seen what he needed to see and was now prepared to supervise the general situation. The days after Lord Bowmont's letter were different. She couldn't have described precisely how. The structure of their days remained the same: the estate work, the meals, the conversations that were still, to an outside observer, the careful and correct conversations of 2 people who had recently become acquainted. But something in the quality of the silence between them had shifted, and she was aware of him in a new way, not the awareness of someone assessing a stranger, but the awareness of someone who has realized the stranger is paying equal and very similar attention back. He brought her a book from London. She had mentioned a title once in passing, not a request, simply the noting aloud of a thing she would like to read eventually. 2 weeks later, it was on her desk with a note that said only, "Found this." "Thought you might." No signature. She thanked him at dinner. He said it was nothing. They were both very careful. On an afternoon in January, when the light came in from the south and the sitting room was warm enough that the fire was optional, and they had both, by independent decision, chosen not to light it, she was writing letters, and he was reviewing the farm accounts when she looked up and said, "You drew a fish in your November tenant notes." He looked up. "A very small fish," she said, "very detailed. A flounder, I thought." He was quiet for a moment. Something in his face did something it didn't usually do. A slight easing, like a window giving a little in a warm room. "It was a flounder," he said. Mr. Harnwick described his drainage problem using an analogy about flounders that morning. I couldn't get it out of my head. "A flounder," she said, "a flounder," he confirmed. She looked back at her letter and did not hide the smile because they were alone and it was January, and she had decided that some things were worth allowing. It was around this time that she noticed something else. She had been in the habit of walking the estate on fair mornings, partly for the knowledge of it and partly because she thought well while moving, and she had begun going out before breakfast when the light was thin and the grass still white, and the air had the particular smell of frost burning off that she found clarifying. On one of these mornings she came back through the kitchen yard and found him there at the edge of the stable yard, doing nothing in particular, or rather, doing something that looked like nothing to a careless observer. Standing with his back against the stone wall in the morning cold, His face turned toward the east field where the light was coming in, not reviewing anything, not conferring with anyone, simply standing and looking at the field. She stopped. He had not seen her. She watched him for a moment, a man alone in the early morning, not performing anything, not managing anything, just standing in the cold and looking at his own land in the light that made everything look like something possible. And then she walked past the yard and back inside before he turned around. She thought about that for the rest of the morning, and then, because thinking about it was not going to produce a useful result before she had more evidence, she set it aside and got on with the day. There was a morning when she came downstairs before the kitchen had properly woken, because she wanted tea, and did not want to rouse anyone for a cup of tea she could make in 10 minutes, and she sat by the kitchen hearth with the warm cup and the sound of the house breathing around her, and the smell of cold ash and last night's bread, and thought about nothing in particular, which was a kind of luxury she had not had in some time. Rafferty found her at 6. He had been to the stables. One of the horses had a strained hock he had been watching, and he came in through the kitchen door in his boots and his stable coat, with the cold still on him, and stopped in the doorway. She looked at him. He looked at her, sitting by the kitchen fire in her wrapper with her morning tea and her unguarded expression, and something passed between them that was not a conversation and required no words. He came in and she poured him a cup without asking, and he took it without comment and sat across from her. And they sat by the kitchen fire for 20 minutes while Lindvale Park woke up around them, and neither of them said very much of anything. She thought later that this was its own kind of answer. The honest conversation happened in the sitting room on a Tuesday afternoon in late January, with no particular arrangement and no plan, which was perhaps why it went as well as it did. She asked him what he had wanted originally from this marriage. He thought about it before he answered, which was his way. Order, he said. Someone capable. A household that worked. He considered the next word. Peace. I have not had a great deal of peace in this house before. Because? He looked at Custard, who was in his armchair in the particular posture of a cat, who has been comfortable for several hours, and intends to remain so indefinitely. Because it was a house without enough people in it, he said, the cat notwithstanding. Custard's ear moved, which was his acknowledgement that this observation had been received and was acceptable. And now, she said, what do you want now? He was quiet long enough that she thought she might not get an answer, which was fine. He could have the silence if he needed it, but when he spoke it was in the careful way of someone who has decided to offer something real rather than something defensible. I don't have a tidy answer. She looked at him. That is the most interesting thing you've ever said to me. He looked back. Is it? Yes, because everything else you've said to me has been tidy, even when it was true. She set down her teacup. Tidy answers are the ones that fit the report. A pause. And the untidy one? Is the one that means something. He looked at the fire. Then he said, in the way of someone who has decided on honesty and is going to follow it through, you read very fast, and you mark your pages with whatever's nearest, which last week was one of my letters. You know the name of every horse in the stable before I thought to introduce them. You made tea in the kitchen at 6 in the morning because you didn't want to wake anyone, and you sat by the fire as if it were entirely ordinary to be the Duchess of Lindvale making your own tea in the dark. He stopped. The fire moved. I have been watching, he said, and I don't have a tidy way to account for what I find. The sitting room was warm. Custard was asleep. Outside the windows, the January garden was bare and still and entirely itself. All right, she said, for the second time. And this time it meant something different from the last time. All right, he said, for the first time. The morning room at Lindvale Park was on the south side of the house, where the winter light came in best, and it had been unused for 4 years because no one had quite gotten around to changing the furniture that the previous dowager, Rafferty's grandmother, had installed with the conviction of a woman who believed that formal was permanent. The chairs were high-backed and precise. The curtains were heavy. The portrait of an ancestor above the fireplace communicated without ambiguity that he had found most things disappointing and was not surprised to find them still so. Rafferty stood in the doorway of the morning room on a February afternoon, with the quality of a man who has arrived at a decision by a route he hadn't anticipated. "We should do something with this room," he said. Henrietta stood beside him. She considered the chairs, the curtains, the ancestor. "What did you have in mind?" "I have no idea," he said. "I thought we might decide together." She looked at him. He was looking at the ancestor with the studied neutrality of a man who was offering something and trying not to make it look like it. "All right," she said, for the third time. And this time it meant yes. Yes to this specifically, and yes to what this is, and I am not going to make a scene about the fact that you said it this way rather than some other way, because this way was exactly right. They spent the afternoon in the morning room. They removed 3 chairs that neither of them could bring themselves to sit in. They had a conversation about curtain colour that established that he disliked anything blocking the south light, and she disliked anything in green, which was useful to know. They stood in the centre of the room deciding where the bookshelves should go. They had an extended discussion about the ancestor's portrait, which was resolved when Henrietta said the east corridor had an empty space where he would look entirely at home, and Rafferty said that this was the most diplomatic relocation he had heard of, and she laughed, and he did something with his face that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family. The ancestor went to the east corridor. What came into the morning room over the following weeks? Her books arranged in a system that was organized by subject, and then by the intensity with which she expected to want them, which she explained to him once, and which he considered with the concentrated attention of a man who has been presented with a logic he hadn't encountered before, and is deciding whether to find it unreasonable or whether his own system, which was alphabetical and had several gaps, was perhaps not as definitive as he had assumed. His notebooks, occupying the writing table he preferred. 2 chairs selected on the basis of being comfortable to sit in for several hours, which turned out to require actually sitting in each candidate and giving it a fair trial. An exercise that produced along the way one honest argument about what constituted adequate back support and a resolution by mutual trial and error. A writing table from the attic that turned out to be from his childhood, which he mentioned without inflection, which she received the same way. Custard arrived on the first Tuesday and claimed the settee with the decisiveness of an animal that has been waiting for a room to be correct for a long time and has now found one. No one moved Custard from the settee. This was a rule established not by decree, but by the quality of Custard's response to any attempt, which was a look of such composed authority that even Mrs. Fenwick, who was not a woman easily redirected, had twice changed her course and gone around. The settee was Custard's. The morning room was, by extension, and by his continued presence in it, also Custard's. He was simply generous enough to share it. March in Yorkshire argues with itself. Wind and thin light and occasional warmth all disagree about what the season should be, and the result is a month that has not made up its mind and expects you to adapt to its ambivalence. On a particular Tuesday in March, the light through the uncurtained windows of the morning room came in at the angle that meant afternoon was becoming evening without committing to it. The fire had been burning long enough to have settled into its purpose. The room smelled of wood smoke and the faint sweetness of the old leather on the writing table and the fresh ink Rafferty had been using since noon. Henrietta was reading. A new book, not Radcliffe. She had moved on from Radcliffe and had ordered something from London that was proving to be exactly what she had hoped. She was at the part in the middle where the good things begin to happen, which was her favourite place to be in any book. Her feet were tucked up in the chair, which Mrs. Fenwick had stopped commenting on after the 3rd week of the morning room's existence. Rafferty was at the writing table. His notebook was open. She could see from her angle that the current page had a small sketch of the gate at the north fence in the margin, and what appeared to be the beginning of another fish. She had stopped being surprised by the fish. She had begun, in fact, to look forward to them. Custard was on the settee. Custard was always on the settee. At some point in the afternoon, she could not have said exactly when, and this was part of what she wanted to remember about it, Rafferty's hand came across from the writing table and settled over hers where it rested on the arm of the chair. Not saying anything, simply there, the weight of it and the warmth. She did not look up from her book. She turned the page. Outside, the March argument continued. Custard made a small adjustment on the settee and returned to his own business, which was the business of being entirely comfortable and allowing this to be sufficient. The fire added its quiet commentary to the room. His hand remained.
I thought I needed silence, a house that ran on time, a name beside my name in ink, a life that stayed in line. Then you found the books I hid away behind the accounts and dust, and looked at me like every secret was a reason still to trust. You walked through winter for the people I had failed to see, and somehow every empty room began to sound like breathing. I don't have a tidy answer, I don't have a perfect plan, but you turn this cold old house into a place where I can stand. You saw the parts I buried under duty, pride and grace, and I don't need a life uncomplicated, I just need your face. You make your tea before the sunrise by the kitchen fire alone. You know the horses by their names. You make this place a home, and every little thing you notice, every page you leave behind, makes me wonder how a stranger came to know my heart so well. I was counting every day since you first walked through my door. Now I know what all that counting was leading me toward. I don't have a tidy answer, I don't have a perfect plan, but you turn this cold old house into a place where I can stand. You saw the parts I buried under duty, pride and grace, and I don't need a life uncomplicated, I just need your face. Let the old reports be wrong, let the careful words fall through. I spent my life being a duke, now I only wanna be with you. So leave your books beside my letters, leave your laughter in these halls. If love is built from quiet moments, then I have been yours through them all. I don't have a tidy answer, but I know this much is true. Every room that once was empty feels like home because of you. You saw the man behind the title, you stayed when you could run, and I don't need a life uncomplicated, I need you, my own. this house alive again.